Black pearl, precious little girl, you've been in the background much too long. Black pearl, precious little girl, come into the sunshine where you belong. Black pearl, black girl, hiding behind the body of a little boy. You knew you were different from the start. Deep in your heart, you would always stand apart from those who were normal, whatever that is.
This is Chanda with Conversations with Chanda, and I'm here today with Andrea Jenkins. Welcome.
Thank you. How are you doing, Chanda?
I'm doing all right. So we're going to start out for the listeners and just have you introduce yourself.
Mm-hmm. My name is Andrea Jenkins. I am the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council. I am a poet, a writer, artist, curator,
A politician.
parent,
Grandparent.
I have 3 grandchildren.
Cutie
Are
pies.
literally my heart. So
Pretty awesome. So, I went and looked and I did a little bit of research on you, and I've known you I feel like my entire life.
yeah,
But I'm like, Andrea got a Wikipedia page.
got a wiki.
Got a wiki. I'm like, let me read this. They say American policy aide, politician, writer, performing artist, poet, and transgender activist. She is known for being the first African-American openly transgender woman elected to public office in the United States.
I don't know how you get a wiki page. Like, I didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I was just online.
I mean, you have to be notable, right?
Apparently.
Apparently, I think you ought to claim that.
I was online and just came across a wiki page. I'm like, well, there's some wrong information. Like, they have my birth date wrong.
My birthday's wrong on everything, too. So the first openly transgender woman in the United States, how did that feel?
Most days it doesn't really feel that much different for me. But it is Black History Month, and, people kind of make a big deal out of it. And it is a big deal, right? It's like, when you think about African Americans in this country, and the number of people who have been elected to representative offices, for Black people, generally, it's very small compared to the broader population. And for LGBT identified people, like, literally, there are only 800 LGBT identified elected officials in the country. So when you put it in that context, there are maybe 10 out trans people. A little more than that, maybe 13. But to be in that number, it's quite incredible. I come from a legacy of enslaved people. Who
built this country.
We were just given got the right to vote, less than 60 years ago. And now I'm in elected office. It's amazing.
It is
I
amazing.
pinch myself every morning when I walk in City Hall.
Do you really?
I do.
Did you see yourself as a politician?
I saw myself as a person who would use policy to help people's lives.
Right.
But I never really thought about what form that might take. Would it be an attorney? Would it be, I don't know, I worked as a policy aide for a long time, and people would ask me, when am I going to run for office? And I would always respond, I'm running away from office. Like, I knew how tough the job was, but it really is an enormous honor to be able to represent the communities in spaces of power, spaces that have historically been off limits to Black folks, to LGBT identified folks, to transgender individuals. So when the opportunity arose, I felt like I needed to step into it, and
you did,
and step up. Yeah.
So when I think about the first, and maybe even not especially, but when I think about the first, where we lead with such humility, you lead with such humility, but I do think that representation matters.
Absolutely.
It just matters, period.
Yeah. And
it's important for other people that might be struggling with either identity, whether or not it's leadership identity, whether or not it's personal, like whatever it is, they're struggling with identity. And do you feel like you being in the role is as much around inspiring and presenting what's possible as it is about the policy?
I honestly believe it's an equal amount of both. I won't name names, but a number of people have said to me that I inspire them to run for office, and they are now in elected office. Our council meetings are televised. Mm-hmm. They are every other Friday. When I am on the dais at the council meetings, I always wear purple so that young queer identified people can see some hope and some inspiration. So it's as much about the representation matters as it is the policies for me.
So, I mentioned that I've known you forever. So I knew you back when, and I knew you through the transition.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this as I was preparing, and I'm like, wow, it feels like the transition was more than what was obvious, right? Like, to me, it's like your leadership felt different. Maybe it's because we were younger.
Yeah.
I don't know. But,
yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like I didn't think you were smart, or any of those types of things. But I just felt like, man, it's like I just feel like you've just like increased every year at what had to be a difficult time. It feels like there was so much that was birthed through that.
That is an amazing observation, Chanda. All my life, I've really known internally my truest identity. However, I was trying to conform to society. As human beings, we want to feel loved.
Right.
We want to feel accepted. We want to be a part of something, our families, our communities. We need that. That's how human beings thrive.
Yeah.
And so I, tried to conform to societal expectations, to familial expectations, cultural expectations of what a Black man should be. As you know, I grew up, I played high school football, I was the president of my college fraternity for a while. I really tried to conform. But in all of that energy spent trying to conform, it sort of tamped down.
Yeah, what was in you.
Right. And once I had the courage to say to myself, this is who you are. You must live your life authentically as possible. Once I did that, it seemed like flowers just began to blossom, to use a euphemism.
Yeah.
It took me 20 years to get my bachelor's degree. And I know that a big part of that was struggles with my gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
And like as soon as I came out, like bam, bachelor's degree, got it done.
Mm.
Then I went on to graduate school and got a master's degree in community economic development. I've always been a writer and a poet, and so I ended up going to Hamlin and getting another MFA in creative writing. Yeah, I became a Bush Fellow. Like, things just opened up. It was like this freedom to be. It's kind of unexplainable, inexplicable. However, I would say that really coming to terms with my own reality and my own authenticity really set all of that in motion.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's pretty tough to do, I think, for people to really live into their full selves. Regardless, I know on the podcast with Caroline Wanga, we talk about just her transformation over the years of like, as she talks about wearing her cardigans to like her dynamic self today. And it was always in there, but it was when she stopped trying to conform that she was also able to like take on new risk and new things.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
You're the first person that I knew to transition. Now I know a lot.
Good.
And I just have so much respect for how I observed it, right? And I've been thinking this week too about Dwayne Wade's daughter.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing all this ugly. Yeah, Kaya. Is it Kaya?
Kaya.
This trans daughter who I think is 11. And having, some of this online stuff that's really pretty awful. And, I guess I just want to just reinforce the point that you said that you knew your whole life, but you just didn't really have the place, the confidence, the support to come out. And when you did, everything sort of manifests. And I just think that when we sometimes think it's something that it turns on when you're an adult and we disregard what young people are feeling or what they're going through. And I hope that there's people that are just paying attention.
Can I just say, I am so proud of Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union for, listening to their young daughter and hearing and supporting her. Transgender people, there's a crisis in the transgender community, particularly for Black women.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that.
Last year in 2019, there were 26 Black women who were murdered, Black trans women, simply for being who they are. And I think, the poverty rate for transgender people is astronomical. The average wages are about $10,000 a year. Homelessness, access to health care, education, attainment, because people get bullied in school, they are, they drop out, they leave, for their own protection. But transgender people who have family support do like 80 times better than trans-identified people who do not have that kind of support. And unfortunately, in the Black community, that support is less than it is in some other communities. And to see Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union step up and be supportive parents and be very, not only just being, because you could be supportive and not be on social media and not, do TV interviews and all of those things. But to be out and open, I think it creates space for other people to step into that as well. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit on your activism related to missing and murdered trans women?
Well, as a poet and a writer, I really try to bring that into the conversation as much as I can. Before I was elected to public office, I worked at the University of Minnesota and I conducted the Transgender Oral History Project, in which I interviewed 193 trans and gender nonconforming people. I was on the other side of the microphone you are today. And that form of activism was really about bringing trans stories to light in their most authentic voice, like not me trying to tell their stories or the media trying to tell it, but trans-identified people themselves telling their own stories and then documenting that and preserving that for history. I feel like that's a big part of activism. I travel around the country and talk to a lot of groups about the issues that impact trans communities. I certainly do that here locally at the University of Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, St. Thomas University, all over the place. Just this past Wednesday, I was on McAllister College speaking. And so, that's kind of my form of activism. Not much of a marcher or, signs and that kind of thing. Though I respect that and I know we need that. Yeah. That's just not my way. Thing either. Yeah.
When, as you're researching and talking to people and just thinking about the challenges, do you physically feel safe in the city? Are you, is it relative? I mean, there's places I go to and I'm like, I don't know if I belong here.
Yeah.
Is the level of, do you have fears around behaviors or?
Up until about 3.5 years ago.
Really?
I felt really safe in most places.
Oh, I didn't expect for you to say that. I thought you were going to, okay, go ahead.
Now, since this administration has been in office, and the vitriol, because just think about it. Before this administration, LGBT rights, trans rights, everything was on a very much upward swing. 2015, the Supreme Court said same-sex marriage was legal. In 2014, Minnesota legislatively said, which hadn't happened anywhere in the country, said that same-sex marriage was legal. Transgender rights, President Obama issued all kind of executive orders that made it safe for people to go to the bathrooms that match their identities, and how schools should be able to
address bullying.
Right, exactly. And that has all changed. And so I feel pretty safe in the city, but going to rural communities, a couple of weeks ago, I was at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. And, New York City is pretty opening and welcoming.
Yeah, but there's a place for everyone in New York City.
Upstate New York, man, it's pretty conservative, pretty red. And on that campus, they had been having a lot of issues around racism and such. And so I'm Black. I'm transgender. I'm 6 feet 2 inches tall. Like, I stand out wherever I am, and it's scary. It's much more concerning now, like I said, than it has been in the recent past.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. It feels, we're just all feeling so heavy. Yeah. And I think reacting to our times in really different ways. It does feel like there's this kind of rise in terms of conversations around race and inclusion and diversity. And I know you're working on increasing equity in our city as a policymaker. Do you think that it's too polarizing, or the issues are too polarized to move through them? Do you think that it requires more education?
I think it requires more courage. I think that more courage and more empathy on the part of white people. There's many more conversations around equity, inclusion, fairness, and at the same time, there's an equal amount of pushback to those conversations. And I think a part of it is fear. Fear that people will lose
power,
resources. And so education could be a part of it, because I think a lot of people really genuinely want to do more, but don't know how. So education has to be a part of that. A lot of people are just stuck and really afraid that they're going to lose something if other people are granted fairness.
Yeah. One of the reasons why we started these conversations was around that point, and we were actually in this very room having a conversation around, what should the conversations with Chanda be, right? Like, what should we be talking about?
Sure.
And should we go out and talk about education, which we will if it's wrapped in a story, right? But like, where should we really be talking about?
There's a lot going on with education in the city of Minneapolis.
Yes, there is.
Today.
I know. So, but what does it mean for us to talk about racism and classism and sexism and the isms and the behaviors and things? And on one hand, it feels like we're talking about them everywhere.
Yeah.
And there's very few conversations that I'm in where I feel like it is unguarded. Right? Unless I'm with another group of Black women.
Right.
Like, it just feels guarded.
Yeah.
And, me thinking, how do we actually get to what we're really thinking? Right? How do people really understand in all the ways that they might be pushing back if they don't have an awareness because they've had this behavior their entire lives?
Yeah.
And so what does it look like for us as a foundation to go on a journey with them? Because we, can recognize that we have our stuff as a sector that we need to wrestle down too. So there's no one perfect in this.
No.
But we will say sometimes, let's get to the action. Like, there's enough conversation. Let's get to the action.
Right.
And, but I just don't know if we're having the right conversations. Do you feel like the city's having the right conversations?
The point you brought up about being guarded is a really poignant point. And I'm not sure if we are having the right conversations. Because, so when you're in the workplace, right, you don't necessarily want to lay out all of your emotional baggage,
anger,
fears, and the challenges that you really face. And every once in a while, it kind of blurts out because the pressure is so intense. But I feel like at the city of Minneapolis, we are getting to those really, really challenging conversations. And they are really challenging. I mean, right now we're talking about how do we make the NRP program, which is no longer called NRP.
Yeah, it's Neighborhood Revitalization.
Now we call it the CPP program, Citizen Participation Program.
Okay. And these efforts are coming out of the report that Cura did?
Yes. They did a racial equity analysis. And, in that work, they determined that a large majority of the funds benefited white homeowners. And it's really not that surprising, right? I mean, there was just a report that came out yesterday that said Minneapolis has the lowest homeownership rate for Black people in the country, and subsequently the widest gap of homeownership between Blacks and whites. And so 78% of all homes in Minneapolis are owned by white people. So if you have a program that's designed to assist homeowners that's, quote, race neutral,
right,
but all the homeowners are white, then subsequently it's going to benefit majority white people. And Cura kind of laid that out in some factual ways. And a lot of neighborhood groups, I mean, literally there's an article in the paper this week that says people feel like you're calling us racist.
How do you respond to that?
It's a challenge to respond. I mean,
it is a challenge to respond to that.
Because, first of all, we live in America, a country that was built on racism. the murder and oppression of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, like those are all racist and all throughout history.
Yeah.
Racism has shaped our country. So it's hard for me as a Black trans identified person to not be racist. Like, I have to work on my own biases every single day because it's all around us. It's in our social DNA.
Yeah.
And so for anybody to say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, right? It's kind of ridiculous.
It doesn't build trust.
Right.
It does not build trust.
You know, it doesn't build trust because they're not being honest.
Or they're being honest and they were raised in such a way to believe, like, I mean, you believe what your parents tell you, right? And when you don't have exposure and you can really believe that you're, you know, color neutral, I'm going to treat everybody the same. And I think by doing that, like on an interpersonal level, like you might actually do that. But to not understand how other things are shaped by race,
Yeah.
I think is just a choice.
Yeah, it's absolutely, particularly when the data is laid out before you. So in 1950s, yeah, maybe so. But now, this is 2020, we know that redlining had a significantly negative impact on communities of color, particularly Black people, but Japanese people, Jewish people, anybody who was not a white Protestant, was redlined out of certain communities. And we still see the impacts of that today. Those redline communities are what we call ghettos, right?
Have you read The Color of Law?
I have.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. The author, Richard Rothstein, will be in the Twin Cities in a couple of weeks, and he'll be a guest on the podcast and talk about that very thing.
Oh, my goodness. That's going to be a fascinating conversation.
I hope so. I mean, I'm Black, like from the city, right?
Yes.
And I know, like, the history as much as I know. I know there's more I could know, but I know that there are things that have happened to African Americans from a policy perspective.
Right.
I think reading that book, I knew, right? Like, I mean, just the way that he was able to weave the stories and understanding, like, just the level of complicitness from
every
the top,
sector.
every sector, everything was actually overwhelming to embrace it. Like, you couldn't hide from it. And I think you can move around things that don't feel comfortable,
and they were very explicit. It wasn't sort of like, oh, we're going to be tricky and try to be subtle. It was very explicit. You used to drive around in most of the South and it would be like, N-word, get out of town by 6 or sundown. Like, and they call them sundown towns, right? I mean, the redlining was no Blacks, no Jews, no Japanese on your mortgage. You live in North Minneapolis, right?
Yep.
It's probably still on your mortgage unless you have went and got
definitely. I have not gotten it off.
Gotten it changed.
I haven't.
And what is really frustrating is, as we try to redress these issues, we can't be that explicit, right? We have to be race neutral now because the laws are such that we can't make policies that favor one group of people over another. I mean, it literally says we're going to continue to perpetuate the inequities that we have created.
So reparations, there's a case for reparations.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
You
know what's so fascinating about that article? Yeah. I grew up in that neighborhood that he talks about in Chicago, West Lawndale. Like, I went to a family funeral back in November, and that's where we were. I mean, like, I literally grew up in that. As I read that piece, just tears just streaming down, because I'm thinking about my grandparents, my aunts and uncles. And
for people that are listening that don't know anything about North Lawndale, you want to give any context to what made you so emotionally respond to that article?
Yeah, well, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates lifted it up because it was just so exemplary of the issues that impact Black Americans all over the country. But North Lawndale was, and still is, an extremely impoverished community. It had historically been a Jewish community, and it's kind of marked by these really amazing homes. They're called graystones, and they took these big blocks of kind of limestone and built houses like you can barely bulldoze these houses. They are so well fortified, and but over time, as Blacks were migrating from the South to the North, really fleeing apartheid, essentially, they would come to big cities like Detroit, Milwaukee, Kansas City, Chicago, and then they would subsequently be sort of forced into certain neighborhoods. And so North Lawndale was one of those neighborhoods, and there were covenants on those houses, but people were able to, once Black people started moving in, all the white people moved out, and so it became this Black enclave. But people were being given mortgages that shady and subprime, and so consequently, it was kind of almost like rent to own kind of mortgages, and if you missed like one payment, like you were evicted, and then they would turn around and sell it to another family, and just getting rich off of the misery of Black people. All the jobs left the community. They built a jail right adjacent to the community. And, people talk about the school to prison pipeline. If you got a jail right next
to a school, and the kids dropping out of school in third grade, where do they go? They end up in the Cook County Jail. Drugs impacted that community. Gang violence, when you hear about all the murders in Chicago, it's not all over Chicago. It's not downtown. It's not on the Magnificent Mile, which is the beautiful Gold Coast, along Lakeshore Drive. It's in North Lawndale. It's on the South Side. It's, in these very concentrated communities where that's happening. And there's this overabundance of guns and drugs and liquor stores right. next door to the projects, next door to the church. In any neighborhood like that near you, right? Like
right.
It's the same sort of setup. So in Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, you thought about your upbringing and your grandparents, and what was it? Was it how hard their lives were and what they had to navigate? Was it understanding more deeply the conditions that they were surviving through? Like, was it all of that? It
was all of that, and so my father spent the majority of my childhood in prison. And for a long time, I was really angry, like, why would you do this? But over time, and particularly reading that article, you could see that the conditions were such that you almost had to be extraordinary to overcome, the literal saturation of heroin and drugs that were in those communities, that are in those communities. The people that are able to survive and make it out are truly exceptional. And so I I think it gave me an awareness of the challenges that my family was dealing with. It's not just the everyday life is hard and, you know, you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing. It was like people were intentionally creating situations to make sure you stayed impoverished, uneducated, and really a cog in the machinery of capitalism.
When we're both in conversations all the time around these disparities, right?
Mm-hmm.
These gaps that we have in our city. And there's a number of conversations where I'm in, if, only we did this thing, then this problem would be eliminated. If we could get more felons jobs, it would be eliminated, right? And so then in my head, I'm like, yeah, but I know Black people at every level that are trying to navigate systems,
right,
and hitting glass ceilings and not getting the recognition in their workplace, or this education gap, which, I recognize that there's daily decisions that are made on whether or not you can, whether or not, whatever those obstacles that you mentioned that your family and our families have gone through. But I don't know if people fully understand all of the policies and the limitations that our community has had to go through. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this disparities could get boiled down to individual choice.
Right.
And if you just made different choices, this would not be a problem. And I don't know if we fully understand the generational impact and the policies that really have created the conditions.
Can we talk
presidential
politics for a minute?
Go there. Go on.
Well, in 2016, Bernie Sanders was a really popular candidate for the Democratic nomination. But I really couldn't. And I everything Bernie talks about, and even now, was really powerful to me. Like, I was feeling it. Medicare for all,
tuition,
get rid of, student debt, all of these things, and more jobs, right? Mm-hmm. But we know that Oprah Winfrey, one of the richest women in the world, on the planet, not richest Black women, one of the richest women, she still is facing discrimination. She walks into Hermes, with her American Express Black card, and they following her around the store like she can steal something. Oprah, right? So unless we address the racism,
right, the policies,
all of those little fixes, they're not gonna change the system. I mean, it might help a few people, and yes, we got to do those things because we got to help a few people that need help. But simultaneously, we have to be working at the deep underlying racism that is really destroying. You talked about school. People say poverty is the main reason why there's an achievement gap. And I'm like, man, Black people are richer than they've ever, as a whole, than we've ever been in the history of this country. Yet our kids are still failing. I mean, you couldn't be any more poor than W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first Black PhD, So it's not just poverty. Yes, poverty plays a role in kids' ability. If they go to school hungry, that's an issue. We need to address that. But that is not the main factor of why kids are not excelling in school, right? It's young white women. Majority of our teachers are young white women, like 85%. And smart, brilliant, really care about kids. But like I was saying earlier, they have the same mental expectations of Black kids in the inner city as everybody else. Mm-hmm. And so the behaviors that young Black kids do versus the same behavior in young white kids gets criminalized versus, oh, that's just boys being boys, right? And that implicit bias plays a role in their expectations. I went to public schools in Chicago, which, have been deemed some of the worst schools in the country. But I had black teachers who were like, no, you can do this. You will do this. You will go home and do your homework and bring it back. Like, they cared about the kids and they had expectations of you doing more.
Yeah. So, I'm in conversations all the time around education, and people are like, if families in the neighborhood, if black families only understood the proficiency rates at these schools, they would choose differently. And, I know from my own experience parenting that sometimes what's valued is very different than what people expect for people to value. Not that education doesn't matter, it does. Oh, yeah. But equal to that are, how am I treated? How are my kids treated? Right. Do I know someone there? I mean, it's a very relational sort of experience of being in a school. Do you feel part of a school community or not is really important.
Right.
And how that plays out looks very, very different. And, I had two teachers that were African American until I got to high school. And then I had 3 African American women that were science teachers at North High. And Miss Cotman was one of them, who's an artist.
Wow.
And so I would see her at school, and then she lived down the street from me.
Beverly
and then
Cotman?
Beverly,
okay.
Yes. And then I would go, she was like my biology teacher or something.
Right.
Yeah, or physics or one of them. But then I would see her at like a performance or whatever, right? And I didn't see, I felt that community, right? I seen her be part of the fabric of community, which really mattered to me at that particular point of my life.
Yeah. Now, to see your, kind of elders and quote mentors in all aspects of life.
And her daughter went to school with us.
Yeah, that really matters.
It does matter. It does matter. So for city council, for your work as an elected, did you come in with any thoughts about what you would want your legacy of service to be?
Wow, that's a tough question. I didn't have I didn't think about it as in terms of legacy. I thought about it more in terms of, we're in this moment in history, and what can I do to change the dynamics for Black people living in Minneapolis in this moment? Now, that could potentially be some legacy. One of the things that we're working on is revitalizing East 38th Street, which had historically been like the center of Black life on the South Side. It was redlined and all the things we talked about earlier, but this was where Black people could have businesses, could own homes, and have commerce. Then the freeway came in and really sort of disrupted all of that. And I know your family has a long history in that community as well. And so to bring that story back into existence and sort of revitalize that corridor to have the kinds of businesses that addresses the needs of the community today, while not displacing people who have been historically in that community and paying dues and living through the hard times. Hopefully that will be some legacy work.
At work. And one of the other things that I know you've worked on is really being out loud about what that freeway did to the community.
Yes.
And you've done some things to hopefully educate and reconcile.
Yeah.
You want to say anything about that work?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been doing is we created this event called Building Bridges, because 35W came in and really separated sort of the Black community from the white community, right? You used to hear about people saying, I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, right? Well, this is wrong side of the freeway.
Yeah.
And it was so apparent that they wanted to keep it separate. The bridge that goes over 35W, the sidewalks were literally so narrow that two people walking in opposite directions, one of them would have to almost walk out into the street in order to pass each other. There was only one street light on the bridge. So at night, if you wanted to cross that bridge, you kind of felt like you were taking your, safety into your own hands because you could barely see. So we created a dinner on the bridge to bring both sides of the communities together. And I'm really proud to say that the Minneapolis Foundation has been helpful in that process, and we appreciate it. But it's about reconnecting communities physically as well as emotionally and intentionally. And those events have been wildly successful, and really is helping towards our goal of rebuilding that kind of community and having these tough conversations, these difficult conversations around race and equity and the things that caused this. There's a documentary, the Jim Crow of the North, and it really focuses on that community quite significantly as being sort of split apart by that freeway. So we use that documentary in our conversations to help people understand, the historical impacts of what happened and how we can come together to try to make change.
I think I think my reaction to the Jim Crow of North might be, as I hear you describe your reaction to a case for reparations. Because my family, both North, was my mother, and then my dad was on the South side, and both of those communities were talked about. And then you're watching the documentary and you're like, oh, that's, you know the people, you know the houses, you know the stories,
I'm getting emotional right now.
Yeah. I mean, and just thinking about it. And, when my dad was younger, he lived, on the north side. And then when the south side opened up for families, it's like, the same families that lived north ended up in the same blocks on the south side because it opened up for people to move, but it was still so restricted. And part of the benefit that I've reaped from that is the community of people that were around us growing up. Like, I definitely benefited from that. But when you understand all of the conditions, it's really quite incredible, I guess.
One of the things that we did in terms of legacy, we renamed a couple of streets, one after Miss Clarissa Walker, who was the neighborhood calls the mother of Sabanthony Community Center. And then we renamed 4th Avenue after Luana Q. Newman, who was the co-founder of the Minneapolis Spokesman Recorder. To really, again, say we have contributed mightily to this community, and we want to recognize and honor these Black women who are very instrumental in that.
It's funny what street names will do on it. I mean, I love going to Atlanta, and part of why I like going to Atlanta is because you see street names of sheroes and heroes, and you see places and you see history that we've contributed to. And you go to other cities, and it's like absent of anything.
And it's not just Martin Luther King Drive. It's like Mother King, Bernice King.
That's right.
Andrew Young Drive.
People underestimate the importance of those things. So I have one more thing, because I said I was going to talk about this, and I want to talk about it. Right. So I remember bumping into you, and I had just had a moment when I was a CEO at Pillsbury United where we had a new staff that came in, and their pronouns were they, them. Okay. And so I've not had to confront that. So I started to see it on the signature line.
Right.
And in my CEO ways, I was like, no. Right. Like, I go and I'm like, why are we doing this? Right. Like, we just spent all this time. There's no quotes, there's no personal statements at the bottom of email. We're trying to, create a brand here. We want to have consistency. We want to make sure that we're portraying this, and I'm not sure this is something I should make exception on. So I make this decision, and I made it really quickly. Like, I saw the email, and I went in, and 15 minutes later, I've decided it's a no.
We're not doing this.
So in the afternoon, I see you. So I'm feeling guilty, right? Like, I'm like, I was really rash in my decision making today, and I was already kind of like stewing on this. And I remember just asking, like, what should I do with this, right? And I, you know, vaguely remember the conversation, and I was a little looser on it. But, you know, if there's a place that I'm super awkward, it's around pronouns. And especially when people say, you know, introduce yourself, you know, say where you work, your title, and your pronouns. And I'm like, I've never had to do this my entire life. I wish it felt more optional. And yet it's an area that I'm just trying to understand.
So I mentioned that I did this oral history project, right? In doing that work, I shifted. And this whole pronoun thing is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not super new, right? Because, you know, as trans people come out, they want to be addressed as the pronoun that they identify with. But it was never like blatant. But I think there's been a much younger community who are not identifying with any pronoun and using they, them to identify themselves. And it's really about trying to respect people's identities and not make a big scene about it. So if we all introduce ourselves with our pronouns, then
we create comfort, we create sense.
Right. It becomes less about the person and more about all of us. Because, you know, there are a lot of, I use the acronym GNC, but gender nonconforming people now. And yeah, the pronouns are challenging. Like, is it she? Is it he? I don't know.
Right. And it was like, I was with them. And then like, well, who else was there?
Right.
You know, like, I mean, I really struggle with just getting it right. And I think my awkwardness doesn't help.
But I would say
it's
important
for
a lot of people, really to be acknowledged as the pronouns.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm definitely not discounting that, and I understand that point of it. And I think I understand now better just the conditions, right? That the conditions are important for someone to perhaps feel safe enough or comfortable enough to be able to identify as they choose. But yeah, I'm going to have to spend some time. But, you know, when I think about people around issues of race, like this was the first time where I'm like, oh, this must be a little bit how it might feel if you're not used to talking about it or being in that conversation. And so I've admittedly probably made some mistakes, and as I'm trying to learn and develop in that way.
We're humans, and humans make mistakes. That's the hallmark of being human, is that we make mistakes. Hopefully, you know, we learn and we don't keep making the same mistake, right? We make different mistakes.
True that. Anything you want to say before we end the conversation?
And I really think that having these kinds of dialogues is really critical to moving humanity forward. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Of course. I am super proud of you.
Oh, thank you. I'm as proud or even more proud of you, Chanda Smith Baker.
Andrea Jenkins, the one and only. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And there you have it. That's Andrea Jenkins and Chanda Smith Baker. Just want to say thank you to Twin Cities PBS Minnesota Original for providing us Black Pearl by Andrea Jenkins. To listen to more episodes and learn more about upcoming events, please visit conversationswithchanda.org. You can also follow Chanda on Twitter at Chanda S. Baker. This is Sue Pak Kienitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Chanda.